Can I ask? Hello? Is it on? Yeah, okay. Can I ask everyone to please take a seat so that we can get started? Okay. Very well then. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here so early. I'm very happy to greet you to our conference. I'm Susanne Nikolchev, the Executive Director of the European Audiovisual Observatory. And as I believe most of you know by now, the Observatory is a part of the Council of Europe. It's based in Strasbourg, and the Council of Europe has been for once quite a lot in the news these days because of the Reykjavik summit on the 16th and 17th of June. But the Council of Europe does much more than what you have heard there in the news. We have, for example, the observatory that serves the audiovisual industry with reliable and unbiased information. And some of you have already been with us at our launching event for the Focus, which is a very important publication, I believe, for this market. Actually, we do it since 26 years. And if you have not been able to join us yesterday, you can still grab copies here at the entrance and in the back, or next to the main stage where we actually have our stand. You see the sail of the observatory actually when you go out. It's on the right side. Now, we have, with this conference, another form of giving you information. So we don't do that only through publications. We obviously do that also through conference. And here today, we would like to highlight some reflections and based on figures that we have on the European cinema sector. Sorry, it's still early. So we have asked ourselves the question, are there diverging paths? Based on, as I said, some observations that we have made. So what were those observations? Well, according to our figures, we can see that the number of admissions went down, whereas the production remained quite stable. And we also observe a certain development concerning the screen experience when you listen around. Is that now premium cinemas which provide you with some luxury entertainment versus the art house cinema? Or a third, strand in that, the theatrical versus the non-theatrical films. And certainly also we see a certain dynamic in favor of production incentives, and we can ask ourselves, how is the trend in contrast for direct public funding? Now, of course, all of this is still also under the impact of COVID, but we should nevertheless start looking a little bit more midterm again and not only go and see what has COVID done. And so that's what we want to do today. We want to understand what has changed in production and exploitation of films. And then, if we have gotten a bit closer there to what has happened, we want to know what the implications are for the two pillars of film public policies, which are diversity and competitiveness. So how have we structured this conference? Well, there is a good habit that we believe any discussion is only as good as the common knowledge shared, the facts that should underlie a discussion. So we will give two presentations, actually two of my colleagues will. First, Martin Kanzler, who is the Deputy Head of the Department for Market Information. He will look at the diverging European box office and production figures with you. And this will be followed by our deputy head of the Department for Legal Information. These are always the two angles that we pursue at the observatory, market and legal. And there, Sophie Vallée will look at the cultural diversity in a competitive industry. Now, just that you are clear, both presentations will be made available on our website, so obs.coe.int. You don't need now to stress, take pictures, you may, but it's not needed. You will see both presentations offered on our website. Now, after those presentations, we will have a panel discussion, which we will organize around 4 thematic blocks. And the observatory colleagues will moderate that. We will always look at market changes, and then in the, flip side, what does that have in policy implications? But now it's time for Martin Kanzler to go ahead and give the first presentation, Diverging European Box Offices and Production Figures, a Loosening Link. Martin, please.
Good morning, everyone. Over the next 10 to 15 minutes, I will share with you some figures that hopefully provide a stimulating background to the panel discussion to come. What I will try to do is to start with the box office development, link that to exploitation potential for individual films, and then link that to production figures. Louder. I'm sorry. Okay, now it works, I think. It's a bit low. I'll try to do this. But let's get started with the fundamentals. You will notice, or not notice, but I'd like to point out that the layout of the slides is actually inspired by the focus. Why am I telling you this? It's not to show off that I figured out how to do waves in PowerPoint. It's to tell you that a lot of the figures that are included in the presentation you will find in this publication, which you can pick up, as Susanne said. Now, but back to box office, or rather admissions. In what we call Europe 28, that is the EU and the UK, admissions climbed back to 657 million tickets sold in 22. That compares to, 960 in 2017. So overall, a recovery rate of 67%. That means in 22, admissions were still down one third lower than they used to be before the pandemic. Of course, this is an average, and situations differ between individual markets in Europe. The highest that we could identify was Denmark, where the recovery rate was actually 87%. On the other end of the spectrum, you have 2 large markets, Italy and Spain, where it was particularly US films that struggled to recover their pre-pandemic admissions. So the overall recovery rates here were well below the European average. As you know, in the first quarter of 23, fortunately, this growth trend continued and recovery rates are increasing. Nevertheless, I would be positively surprised if by the end of this year admissions were really close to pre-pandemic levels. I think the habits of cinema going has changed, and it will just take time to change that habit again, and a bit more time, I think. How did box office do? Box office grew a bit more than, or recovered slightly better. We're estimating that it's at 5.1 billion euros in 22 compared to 7 something before the pandemic. And that, of course, is due to a slight increase in the average ticket price in 22. It has been stable over the past years, but in 22 it increased. Also, I guess, mostly due to the overall inflation. and perhaps it's 7.7 euros compared to 7 euros before. And perhaps this is also a good point to point out the limitations of average values. I guess when you go to the cinema, you hardly ever pay 7.7 euros. It's much more expensive for certain films and much less expensive on special days where you have an offer. So average values will show a big picture development, but have their limitations, of course, in interpretation. So that's the status quo of the box office. The screens, on the other hand, despite 3 catastrophic, very difficult box office years, have not declined at all. They have remained stable thanks to public support. And the situation here is more or less the same in most European countries. So there is hardly any country that really sticks out in terms of a lower screen infrastructure. So the screens are still there, and so are films, at least when you measure it in terms of film releases. It's always tricky to estimate the number of film releases on a cross-border pan-European level. But thanks to our Lumiere database, where we try to track every film that is being released in Europe, we can at least have a rough estimate. So for 22, we could identify at least 2,200 films that were released in 22. And that compares to 2,350 in 2017. So compared to the pre-pandemic average, it's at least 91% of the films are back. And when you compare the index development between releases and admissions, you can see that the number of film releases never dropped proportionally to the same extent as box office. And this gap that opened therefore in 2020 still exists, meaning that in 21 and 22, both film releases and box office have been growing more or less proportionally. This gap has not closed yet. I believe this number is actually underestimating the first releases for 22, also as indicated by the fact that in all the large markets that published data separately, this recovery rate is actually way above this average of 91%, and in Spain it's actually higher. So in Spain last year, more films were released than before the pandemic. Now, I guess there are not many among you who would sign off the statement that screens are back, films are back, everything's fine. And of course you'd be perfectly right to do so. We'll see when you take a closer look at the film offering that there are 2 very important things. The first one is European films are back. Actually, there are more European films released than there were released before the pandemic. What is down is the number of US films. Before the pandemic, on average, there were about 280 US films released, and this is down to 204. Whereas we could identify roughly 1,600 European films being released more or less constantly over the years. Here, for comparison purposes, I'm just contrasting 2020 with the pre-pandemic times, as I think for this, the 2 really COVID years with lockdowns are not really interesting in terms of data development. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that we have this reduction in the number of releases is not really that visible in the lower crossing segment. So when it comes to films that sell 1,000 to 100,000 tickets, it's more or less the same number. So there was no reduction in releases at all. Where there were significant releases, reduction is in the segment above 500,000. To give you a figure, before the pandemic there were around more than 40 films that sold more than 5 million tickets. In 22, that was only 20. And that makes a huge impact on the overall box office. The same, more or less, the same applies for the segment 1 million to 10 million, 1 to 5 million, where it used to be more than 100 films, now it was 60 in 22. And even the segment 500,000 to 1 million, where you had another 90 films before, and now it's less than 60. And also within the segment of above 5 million, what is interesting is at the very top end, you had 3 films. It was Avatar, Top Gun, and Minions that sold more than 30 million. This is actually pretty good compared to pre-pandemic times, where sometimes you only had 1 or 2 films that sold more than 30. But you did not have a single film selling between 20 and 30 million, whereas before the pandemic there were always 4 or 5 films doing that. And even more strikingly is the number of films selling between 5 and 10 million. There used to be 25 films before, and now in 22 it was only 10 films. So however you define mid-tier films, US mid-tier segment, these data clearly show that there are less US blockbusters and yes, less US and European, and also less European blockbusters, and less US mid-tier films. When we have a closer look at the drop in admissions, you remember it was a 33, no, we'll get to that. Starting with comparing the admissions to European films and US films. You can see that in contrast to US films, admissions to European films never dropped to the same extent. Admissions to US films really collapsed in 2020, but they have been growing quite strongly back, so that in 22 they recovered more or less to the same extent, but European films still recovered slightly better than US films, taking a market share of 28.4%, which is really at the upper end of the usual bandwidth that European films take, and European films taking 65%. So while there is a significant difference in the number of releases, there is not a huge difference in the development of the admissions to European and US films. And doing the same exercise now by admission bandwidth, you remember that admissions in 22 were down 33%. And as you might imagine, this decrease does not stem from the lower crossing films. It's really the loss in admissions in the higher crossing segments of 500,000 and more. Now, when you reflect that I'm now focusing on European films. We have even more European films, but admissions to European films did not grow proportionally. We have less European films and they're more or less at the same level. It does not come as a surprise that as a consequence the average admissions to European films have been decreasing significantly in 22, whereas average admissions to US films have actually remained stable over the past in 22 compared to 2019 and 2018. And what is interesting here is to see that these average admissions to European films not only dropped in 22 or in the pandemic, they were already starting to drop in 2018 and 2019. Of course, not to the same extent. And we also looked at average admissions within the bandwidths. And there you can see that it's primarily within the high crossing segment, above 3 million here, we took that bandwidth. Here the average admissions to US films increased, and the average admissions to European films decreased significantly in that segment. I think there were up to 10 European films selling more than 3 million before the pandemic. In 2020, 21 and 22 it was one single one. That is causing this average and the overall average to decline that much. Whereas in the segment between 200,000 and 3 million, the European films did used to have a higher average admissions. That slowed down a bit in 22. The US films had the opposite, but basically it's the same average admissions. And in the low crossing segment, it's also not significant. So it's really in the high crossing segment that the average admissions went down. What does that mean in terms of concentration? We've looked at two indicators that you can use to measure concentration. The first one would be the number of feature films that it takes to generate 80% of the total admissions. And you can see that this number is slightly down. In 22, it took 136 films to reach that 80%, and it used to be between 140 and 150 before the pandemic. So it's less films that it takes to generate 80%. And another indicator is the share of the top films, and that is really quite telling, I think, is that the share of just the top 10 films in total box office in Europe increased from 23% to 32%, just the top 10 films. Then when you look at the top 50, this increase is already much lower. It's from 57 to 61%. And when you look at the development of the share of the top 100 films, that's basically the same. So it's really the concentration among a very few top films that has increased. Now, you might think lower box office for 3 years, lower average admissions, higher concentration, that might have an impact on production levels that you're seeing, but it's not the case at all. In 22, we estimate there were about 1,960 theatrical feature films, fiction and documentary films produced in the EU and the UK. That is the second highest level in recent history after 2019, and basically identical to the pre-pandemic average of 3 years. And this is true for many individual markets as well. Of course, you have differences. In some countries it's lower, but in most countries it's at the same level or actually higher, particularly again in Spain and Italy, where you remember the box office, on the other hand, was significantly below the European average. How is that possible? I'm assuming comparable to screens, it's because of public support. We also have data on analyzing financing structures, and these are data up until 2020 because we always have a time lag here. But we can tell that public support, either taking the form of direct public support or production incentives, cumulatively account for about 40% on average for the financing volume of European films. And here is one interesting development that the provisional data that we have here suggests that the share of production incentives in the financing plans has increased over those years, while the share of direct public funding has reduced a bit, which would somehow be consistent, of course, also with this not seeing a drop in production despite lower box office, as production incentives are generally not linked to box office, where direct public funding in many cases has at least an indirect link to underlying box office. One other thing that these figures raise is that up until 2020 at least, we do not see in the financing plans that we have any role for streaming platforms. More or less the financing structures of these theatrical films have remained stable. Of course, there's a huge selection bias here because we only have access to data to films that are being supported by national film funds. And these films, up until 2020 at least, normally were linked to the condition of a theatrical release and the IP to be kept, so we're not compatible with the streaming financing model. Of course, we all know that there are many films out there that are being produced by the streamers, also and financed in Europe. The data that we have would see that we identified in 2022 75 films that were produced by the global streamers, that is primarily Netflix, to be frank, and that, of course, increased. Now, compared to the overall production level of what is almost 2,000 films, this does not seem like much. However, when you assume that those 75 films, if released in cinema, would be films that would be mid-tier films and would sell more than 500,000 films, you can see that the production level of the streaming films is basically the same as the really the theatrical European film. So it's quite significant in this context. To conclude, we have higher concentration, lower box office, lower average admissions. Having said this, theatrical exploitation has always been difficult for the mass of European films, but it seems to have become slightly more difficult. And the other thing that is interesting is that production really seems to be unaffected by 3 years of lower box office, raising the question of whether this link between underlying box office and production is loosening. And that's to be discussed, not by me, but by the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin. I think we let him now stretch. He has deserved it. And we call our next speaker, Sophie Vallée, who will talk on cultural diversity in a competitive industry, a twofold objective for multi-level public policy. So you're now going to the legal angle and policy angle. Sophie.
Good morning, everyone. Just over 20 years ago, during the negotiations of the GATS agreement on the free trade of services, the European Union recognized the specificity of film and audiovisual services and reaffirmed the need to preserve and develop its capacity to define and implement policies for the sector in order to preserve cultural diversity. 20 years later, there is now a consensus on the need to promote cultural diversity. But 20 years later, the industry has changed also a lot with the rise of on-demand services, new ways of consuming content, more concentration on the market, and new players at each segment of the value chain. So this has raised again the new question as to how ambitious public policies can accompany these changes. Are the goals the same as 20 years back? And are the results the one we expected? What are the ins and outs? What is the situation at member states level? In order to try and answer these questions, we are now going to look at first the legal basis for the intervention of the European Union in the cultural side and competition field. Secondly, we will have a snapshot of the EU legal tools that are used and also the main principles behind these tools. And finally, we will look at the different types of intervention that takes place at national level and see the diversity of approaches in the European Union. But let's first have a look at the legal treaties, the EU treaties. The EU action in the film and audiovisual sector is based on a twofold objective. First, promoting culture, and secondly, to ensure the competitiveness of the industry. On the cultural side, the EU treaties establish the competence of the EU to contribute to the flowering of culture according to Article 167, paragraph 4 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. But the treaty also provides for a principle of subsidiarity for EU action on cultural matters, meaning that the action of the EU is to encourage cooperation between the member states and, if necessary, supporting and supplementing its action. On the other hand, on the industry side, the EU is competent with the member states to ensure that the conditions for competitiveness of the sector are ensured according to Article 173 of the TFEU, but the EU has exclusive competence for establishing competition rules in the internal market, which means that the EU is also responsible to set the state aid rules in the film sector. But what are the legal tools based on this treaty that are put in place to fulfill these objectives? And what are the principles behind? In a snapshot, we can see that a complex multidimensional legal framework was put in place at European level. It includes a set of directives on copyright and related rights and their management. It includes rules and state aid criteria in EU competition rules and in the communication on state aid for the sector. It includes a set of regulation and directives organizing the principle of territoriality. And at the cornerstone of this framework, we find the European Audiovisual Media Services Directive, which sets the rules and obligations to audiovisual media services. And it is accompanied on the support side by the Creative Europe programme, which, through its media strands, supports actions to encourage competitiveness, innovation, and sustainability of the European audiovisual sector. So looking first at the Audiovisual Media Services Directive as the regulatory pillar for the sector, this instrument dates back to 1989 in its first version. It was called at the time the Television Without Frontier Directive. It was revised several times, and its last revision dates back from November 2018. The deadline for transposition at national level was September 2020, but in practice, the implementation in the member states was completed only in December 2022, which means that it is still quite recent, and we don't have yet the full impact on this directive. So what does this directive say in relation to services? First of all, in relation to TV broadcasters, Article 16 and 17 of the AVMS directive include some obligations for promotion and distribution of European works. In practice, broadcasters shall allot more than 50% of their time to European works, according to Article 16, and they shall dedicate at least 10% of their transmission time, or alternatively at least 10% of their programming budget, for European works created by independent producers. And a part of these works shall be recent. And if we look at a recent report that was published a few days ago by the Commission, it seems that these obligations are quite well fulfilled at national level. Now, if we look at the promotion of European works in on-demand services, these obligations were quite strengthened in the last revision in 2018. And it provides for a minimum quota of 30% of European works in the catalogues of VOD services. On top of this, VOD services shall promote these works on their catalogues, what we call prominence obligation. And according to a new Article 13.2, the directive says that the member states are allowed to impose financial obligations on VOD services that would be located outside of their countries, but targeting the national audience of the country. And these financial contributions may take the form of direct investment obligations in creations and levies as a contribution to a national film fund. So all these policy tools are based on a set of common principles. The support of the film as an art or cultural form with territorial or regional reference, the support of independent production of European or national ownership, meaning that the producer owns the underlying rights and has the creative and artistic control, the territorial exploitation of the rights, and the theatrical exclusivity window at the beginning of the exploitation cycle. But how are these principles understood and implemented at national level? Do all the member states have the same understanding of these principles? Looking first at the first of these concepts, the European work, well, this is defined in the directive in a rather broad and open way. the directive refers to the country of origin of the producer. And the definition in Article 1N of this directive says that European works are works that are originating in the member states of the European Union or in a third country which is part to the Council of Europe Convention on Transfrontier Television, or works that are co-produced in the framework of agreements between those countries. But this directive sets a minimum harmonization, and each member state may lay down more detailed definition. And according to a study of the Observatory of 2019, we found out that some countries go much further and include other criteria. It may be linked, for example, to the residence country of the technical crew, of the creative part, the creative team, the technicians, the workers. It may be linked to the supervision and the control of the production company, the level of participation and co-production, and so on. And this is without mentioning the definition of the audiovisual work itself, which is not harmonized, and depending on each country may refer to different type of works. Now, if we look at the second concept at the basis of these European tools, we find the concept of independent producer. But what does it really mean, an independent producer? In the US, an independent production company is, or an indie film, for example, refers to a film that was financed primarily outside of the major studios. Under the European approach, various definitions are used, although the emphasis seems to be put on the ownership of the production company. Thus, if we look at the Article 17 of the Audiovisual Media Services Directive, it refers to the independence of the producer from the broadcasters. And if we look in the recital of this directive, recital 71, criteria are used such as the level of sharehold in the production company and vice versa, or the level of turnover that a single producer would make with a single broadcaster. At national level, there is no harmonized definition either, and the concept of independence may mean different things and vary depending the region or the legislation. In most cases, it's not a clearly defined concept in many countries. Some countries have come up with more detailed legislation, like in France or Italy, including with rules in relation to the retention of IP rights to define the independence of the producer. So one may wonder how will this concept will be understood when it comes to a market where an increasing number of SVOD services are producing content. Now, another concept on which, another principle on which these tools lay is the principle of the windows, the regulating or not release windows. This is a major principle according to which films first go through the theatrical exclusivity as the first window of the exploitation cycle. This is a business model. It's also called media chronology, and it creates some holdback periods which are defined before a film can be released in each of the subsequent windows. So this is a way to maximize the generated profit while avoiding competition between those exploitation markets. So if we look at the most common media chronology, we have first the cinema window, then retail, then rental, then pay TV, SVOD and free TV, and the last one sometimes in another way around. So this system is based and is anchored in EU law. The competition rules recognize it as a distortion of free market rule, which is acceptable under competition rules as it aims to promote film production. On the other hand, the Article 8 of the directive, including its last version, ensures impose on member states to ensure or request member states to ensure that the services respect these windows where they exist. But if we look at national level, we see that there are different systems in place. Some countries set the window system in the legislation itself, like in France or in Bulgaria. Many countries set the rules in the film agency rules, like in Austria, for example, or Ireland, and some countries rely on industry agreements, like in Spain or in Denmark, and some countries rely also on the three just to decide the rules. And this is without mentioning the different holdback periods that are agreed on a national level. So the result is a quite fragmented market in terms of applicable rules in Europe, or better said, a diversified European landscape in terms of public policies. But in all cases, if we look at the logic behind public intervention, it is based on two rationale. On the one side, the direct support coming from the states, which can go through state aid or fiscal incentives, and on the other hand, obligations on the industry players, which can go from levies and taxes, financial obligations, quotas, and prominence obligations. Let's have a look first at the public aid arm. Each country in Europe supports its film sector, either for cultural reasons or for economic ones. And support is also granted at regional level and supranational level. But various types of aid are found at national level. The aid can be refundable loans, non-refundable subventions, investment in capitals. They can be automatic, in which case they are granted on a basis on the fulfillment of predefined criteria, based on objective, measurable indicators. And this can be theatrical attendance, number of screenings, awards and prizes, and so on. And these are usually granting higher rewards. On the other hand, they can be granted according to selective schemes, where the film goes through a panel of film commissioner, which will decide on the support based on selection of criteria which are linked to the cultural and artistic aspect of the project. And the awards granted are usually lower. The process also differ depending on selective or automatic. Then the aid can concern different stages of the filmmaking process, from pre-production to distribution and exhibition. And then the format may also differ. We have support for films, series, documentaries, animation, and so on. Now, if we look at fiscal incentives, an increasing number of countries in Europe have introduced such automatic schemes in order to attract investment and boost the local economy. And today, across Europe, we count 33 different European different schemes, and all of these schemes may come from different legal sources. They may be created in the general state budget law, or in the tax law, or even specific law related to culture. And they can take different forms like tax shelters, tax rebates, and tax credits. If we have an overview of fiscal incentives in Europe, we see that most countries now have put in place some kind of incentives for production. And we see that many countries have put in place rebates, but also we find in some countries tax shelters, tax credits, and different kind of mechanisms. Now, looking at the other side of the public intervention, we see the financial obligations which are put in place, imposed by the states on the audiovisual services in order to contribute to the ecosystem. So I will focus specifically today on the financial contribution, which can be found in levies and taxes, and financial obligations. As we have seen, the Article 13 of the Audiovisual Media Services Directive gives the possibility of the member states, that's not mandatory, but member states are enabled to impose a financial contribution into production for the VOD services based on their territory, but also outside of their territory. Now, if we have a look of how so far the countries have taken chance of these possibilities, we see on the right-hand side a map with quite many colors. On the other side, it's the investment obligations by TV broadcasters, and on the other side, it's by VOD providers. We see that, as I mentioned, the directive has been implemented quite recently, and still many development takes place at national level with new laws popping up every 2 months, and sometimes with new financial contribution obligation. And we can see that some countries have used the possibility to have direct investment into production. Others have used levies only. Some countries give the alternative to the services to choose between direct investment or the payment of levies. And some countries, like for example France or Portugal, have applied both obligations. So, in conclusion, we have seen that public policies are based on promoting culture and competitiveness, that this objective is still at the core of the public intervention, but we have seen also that there is an increasing number of incentives and automatic schemes appearing at national level, which may challenge the aim of cultural diversity. We have seen also that policy tools are based on common principles, but there is no common understanding of these principles at national level. We have seen also that there is a strengthening of obligations to promote European works, and especially through the financial contribution in European works. But we have seen a very fragmented approaches at European level. So this raised some fundamental questions that I leave for the discussion with our panelists, such as cultural competitiveness. Are these goals still valid today? Do the tools match the goals? What is cultural diversity and a to-the-market reality? And you have 1 hour.
Thank you very much, Sophie. I think we have really seen that the film market in Europe is embedded in a highly complex system, and that there is a lot that we have still in open questions. That means we are now really ready for the panel. I would like to ask the panelists to please join us on the stage. And that gives me a little bit of time to thank to some members of the advisory committee, which is a very dear committee to the observatory, that helps us really pose the hopefully right research questions when we think about what projects to do. And this time they have also helped us setting up the panel. So thank you to the European Producers Club, CEPI, UNIC, Cineregio, EFAT and Europa Distribution. And all of this has resulted in, I think, a highly interesting set of panelists, which I'll be happy to introduce to you. So you see the person who is kindly supplying the colleagues with water is actually Laurent Dutoit. So we use our panelists also for services. He heads Agora Films. Agora Films is an independent distribution company founded in 1999, and they distribute between 10 and 15 films each year in cinemas, but also on other windows. Next to him, we have Dida Domeri. She founded Maneki Films in 2009. And if I'm rightly informed, since then, they have produced 18 films, both French and international co-productions. Her latest film, Une Nuit, directed by Alex Lutz, will actually close this year's Cannes Un Certain Regard. So if you have a chance to get tickets, not so easy, we all know, try it. Next to her, we have Thomas Eskelsen. He is head of strategy at Film Invest. Film Invest is a regional Swedish film fund, but Thomas is also chairperson of Cine Regio, the European Network of Regional Film Funds, and he is the author of a report which I understand becomes a series on public funding at the crossroad. Now, next to him, we have Mariela Bisuevsky. She is producer at Tournesol Media from Spain, so we are back with the country of honor. Very pleased about that too. Tournesol has produced over 150 films since 1987, won an Oscar for the best foreign language film for The Secret in Their Eyes, and also many prizes, Cannes, San Sebastian, and they received many Goya Awards. But now Tournesol also engages in TV series. Now next to Mariela, we have Chris Marcic, who is the COO at the Croatian Audiovisual Center, I think since 2019. And he's also board member of the European Film Agencies Directors Association, which brings together the heads of the European national film agencies. Next to him, you'll see Askar Fligarbeck-Thomsen. He is CEO at Nordisk Film Cinemas, the exhibition branch of Nordisk Films. And Nordisk Films is also active in production and distribution. For cinema exhibition, they are the leading cinema chain in Denmark and Norway, and they are also present in Sweden. And next to Ansgar, you see Gilles Fontaine, who is the head of Department for Market Information at the Observatory, and he and Sophie will now co-moderate that interesting panel. I hope you enjoy.
Okay, let's go. Thank you, Susanna. So we will structure or try to structure the discussion under three main topics. We would like to start discussing cinema exhibition, then move to the financing and exploitation in film, and third topic discuss to the role of the producer. So we'll try to keep that storyline during the panel. And we'll start right away by discussing cinema exhibition. And my first question obviously will go to you, Asghar. If I broadly summarize what Martin explained at the beginning of the conference, it's for 2022, a deficit of big US blockbusters, each doing quite good individually speaking, but a problem of number, a deficit of mid-tier US films, and still a stable level of European film on release, but struggling to get the same level of admission that they used to. That's my take. Does it match your observation on what happened in 2022? And are we still here in mid-2023?
Well, it's an interesting, complex thing. But the reality in this is that what we are really missing is the American blockbusters. And we could have the perspective from European film that we want to promote European films, and we should be very proud of the high share we have right now. But we shouldn't pride ourselves too much because it's from a very low level. And what really happens in cinema going is that the blockbusters, they are like a flywheel. They provide the big momentum for the cinema going. And that is because the blockbusters, they attract a broad audience who's then exposed to trailers, who then will actually explore more genres than the blockbusters. So we actually need the blockbusters from the United States as like a locomotive to drive the whole attendance of all films here in Europe.
So you do believe that there was a change of habit, but that there is a need for the blockbuster to bring back people to cinema, but that indeed this habit was lost?
Well, it's not lost because the audience is still there. We just need the blockbusters to activate the audience. I mean, COVID was a huge learning lab. Nobody before COVID would have said, let's try to reduce the number of titles to 20% and see what happens. But that was the case under COVID. And what we in several cases learned is that if we covered the genres quite well and the target groups as well, then you would actually have close to 60% of the admissions with 20% of the titles. But if you want to bring up the overall number of titles, you need the blockbusters because they activate a broader audience. there's a core audience who will see all kinds of movies, but there's also a core audience who's lesser connected to the cinema and using the broad number of titles. And when they are actuated with the larger titles, they are likely to continue to expand their knowledge of film and film experience and see a broader selection of titles.
And by mid-2023, are we back? Do you have visibility on the real, actual lineup of films until the end of the year?
Yes, I mean, 2023 will be an improvement over 2022, but that's not much. The problem here is also that, yes, we do have more American blockbusters, but I mean, bottlenecks or lack of movies, you have both in this year, because I mean, in July, we have like 4 blockbusters on top of each other. And I mean, that's not good for the blockbusters, and it's not good for other films as well. So what we really need is a evenly distribution of blockbusters all over the years to attract and activate the audience the whole year.
A parallel question to you, Laurent. Again, the figures seem to suggest that more European films are struggling to achieve the same level of results than in the pre-pandemic years. Is that your impression too?
Yes, but maybe we shouldn't injure ourselves always saying because that the figures are low, because if we look at other out-of-home entertaining play, concerts, even football or any kind of sports event, there are still many more people that are going to the cinemas that are attending those kind of other form of entertainment. So the difference is that for cinema we have the data, and you are providing us with excellent results because we have that since the decades. We got no idea how many people are watching a football game in a stadium in Europe, and but I managed to get those data in Switzerland, and in Switzerland even last year it was a bad year for cinema. It was 9 million admission, but for the football it's 2 million. So it's still we still have many more people that are watching films. So that was for me the main point. And then I don't remember what was your question. Sorry.
No, I was asking beyond the global figures on a film basis, or talking about your investment decisions. Is it true that more European films struggle to achieve the same level of admission than 3 years ago, basically?
Yeah, but of course there's the American blockbusters, but we are also struggling for European films, of course. And we were mentioning mid-tiers films. There's no real definition of mid-tier films because it's not the same for US films than for European films. And for me, the mid-tier films are the films that will be launched in major festivals such as Cannes. And we've seen that those last years, but it was already the case before the pandemic, those festivals are targeting more and more hardcore art house films, so films that have cultural perspective, but with a really small audience. And we are really struggling to get those good art house titles that could appeal to an audience and make those millions of admission in Europe. And those films are really rare. We have a huge number of really small films where in the end most of them are publicly funded, so they don't really need the box office revenue from the different states. And for those films, maybe we are, I say we, so it's the global approach. The producers, the film funds, and everybody are happy that they exist, that they are shown in a festival, and it's the end of the story. And for me, it's I'm a distributor. I'm also running cinema. I'm also an exhibitor. And for me, I'm really trying to be able to make that the films that I like are watched by people, because it's why we are here. We want those films to be watched.
Didar, I know from the preparatory calls that you do not have exactly the same approach to the role of festival. So I'm jumping on the remark from Laurent to me ask you to see the role of festival from your point of view.
Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be with you today. I think that the role of a festival is really essential for many people in the industry, for producers first, for directors, of course, for sales agents. Under the red carpet, we have the market that we are in, and this is exactly where, during Cannes, thanks to the red carpet, sales agents, producers, talents can be sold to other countries. And so when, during COVID, suddenly all festivals shut down, the industry was totally paralyzed because they couldn't show their films, they couldn't sell it in these markets, they couldn't create any buzz around those films, and the journalists couldn't review them. So personally, I had films in that period of time waiting to be selected in festivals and shown and released. And of course, not all the films are made to be shown in festivals. The festival is a place that you discover talents, emerging voices, and it's a key partner for a director, for a producer. And I think that also not having them during this COVID time was really paralyzing us. So for me, it's essential, really.
Yeah. Mariela, maybe also on the role of festivals?
I have a slight different point of view as Didar.
We had a debate earlier.
Had a debate already. I think that the role of festival has been changing during these 20 years. And it's true that I agree completely that for a first film or a difficult film, a specific film, it's essential. Some films don't exist if they don't go to a festival. But also I think that the festivals during these years, as he said, have been focusing in more authorial or hard films, and they lost a little bit the link with the audience. Years ago, there were the two vias in the festivals. You had the ones that were more open and the ones that were really authorial or focused or hard films. But now, more and more, the festival has focused on this side, and even I feel there's kind of an endemic thing, because almost all festivals, I think, they have these labs of developing new talent, which those films will go to the festival when they are done, if they are done. So there's a little bit of pushing the kind of films that festival selects also. And in terms of promotion, the films, I feel that the films that are selected in big festivals, the promotion is very important for the territory itself. Let's say we had two very big examples last year. Alcaraz that won Berlinale, and Asbestas that was here in Cannes, and they had a huge box office in Spain. Asbestas had internationally also, but the other films that come from Cannes to Spain don't really have that impact in the Spanish box office. I mean, the promotion that a festival abroad gives to that kind of films in Spain is not meaningful. That's what I feel. They are sold, it's true, but they don't have an impact in
I think that without the festival, they wouldn't even been distributed in these countries.
Probably, but we don't know.
And I think the role of a festival is not to make in sort of those films having good admissions. This is not the role. The role is really for us to discover emerging talents. And without them, we won't discover the talents of tomorrow. That will make box office maybe with the second or third film. Without the first feature film that doesn't really make admissions, which is not really what is at stake. I think that we should really focus on the fact that this is a place where we're going to discover voices. And we're going to accompany after the second and the third, thanks to all these journalists and all this community of distributors all around the world. These directors are going to emerge, and the second, the third film, this community will grow. And this festival place is essential for that. For me, it's key.
Yeah, but it was like that 20 years ago, and it
Yeah.
worked like that 20
Yeah.
years ago because you had admissions and you had time
I
to
agree.
nurture it with small films that will grow gradually. And now, and we saw that with the admissions, we almost have only those quite small films, first and second films, without any appeal to the audience. And those directors, they can't really grow and make admissions after that.
But we need to help them to grow. We need the public funding to help them still to be developed and to emerge, because without seeing them emerging, they're not going to be any interesting directors of tomorrow.
But the festivals are also tools to help. And if you only focus on the first film, it's not the easiest one. The easiest one might be the first or the second film. You know that in a career, third, fourth, fifth film is a difficult one. And that's why I think the audience should be a little bit more.
I guess we are talking about finding a balance. No, nobody
Yeah,
is
it's fine.
only
Yeah, that's
first
it.
film, but to have a mix of different categories of films within the
Absolutely.
festival. That's what
I'm saying.
that's what is the discussion, not against or in favor of. Going back to well, we are not far, but to cinema exhibition, there is another topic I would like to touch upon, and first with you, Asghar. We have been hearing about premiumization of cinema films, of theaters, with providing a luxury experience, increasing price. Is it a trend? Is it a must for cinemas to go in a more upward scale? Is it happening, basically, the premiumization of cinemas?
That's an interesting expression. I mean, what cinemas are doing, and what probably all cinemas are doing, and then their programming, in their seats, in their screen, in their sound, they're trying to cater for the needs of the audience. And that is where the investments go. We will invest where the audience is willing to pay for it. And by that, we'll increase the pool of money that goes to everybody in the supply chain of movies. So what's very important for cinemas is that they have a profit, because otherwise they can't invest. And what we see, at least I would say in the Scandinavian market, is that if you invest more, then you actually also have a stronger attendance. So investment is absolutely necessary, and that means that profit for cinemas is absolutely necessary in form of catering for the needs of the audience.
Laurent, I guess you are dealing with both, let's say, multiplexes and art house. I'm not even sure it's making such a difference is relevant, but still, do you see differences increasing between category of exhibitors, or everyone trying to invest and increase the experience?
Not yet, but maybe in Switzerland we are always really slow, so it will come later on. But if we look at what is here in France with Pathé, they really said that for them premium cinema is the future of cinema, and I'm quite perplexed with this statement, because cinema is also an art that is targeting everyone, from the higher rank of the society, with people with real money, and those who don't really have any. And if you are always increasing the price, you will lose a huge part of the population. So I think we see that there is space, and maybe a bigger space, for premium cinema, and so it's important to have that within every cities, but still to have cinemas that will be accessible for anyone, the middle class, and also the workers and those with lower income.
Would you like to react?
Yes, it's quite interesting about the ticket prices. It's the debate, it's the ongoing debate always. When we look at our admissions, and actually that goes back to pre-COVID times, and we had then around 9 million admissions a year, and even if we look by country, it was actually the price, it was like a normal distribution, if anyone understands what that is, means that there's actually both very high and very low spread of the price. And I think it's a very very valid point. Yeah, this we are investing, and yes, for that we are raising the average price, but the spread on the price is actually quite big. For our company, it's around 30% up and down, actually.
Okay. Thanks, Sophie. Maybe we could now start discussing, let's say, the more policy side of cinemas and cinema support.
So in the context that is described, lower box office figures, higher concentration, lower average admissions, one may ask from the point of view of public policy whether the approach taken so far is the correct one, or whether certain action for the sector should be reviewed or remodeled or increased. My question would go to Chris as a CEO of a film agency and member of the board of the EFADS. Most national public support goes in priority to production and to a lesser extent to distribution. What about cinemas? Is there a need for more support in view of the changes in the sector to accompany these changes towards premium theaters, to attract back the audience? What are your views on this, Chris?
Thank you very much, Sophie, and hello to everyone. I'll start with just a digression of 2 minutes on the EAO data and the importance of the data. It informs policymakers. It's important that the data represent as correct and as detailed a picture of the situation in Europe as is possible. So if data for smaller countries indicate that there are no films from those countries on streaming services, 0 needs to be put in there so it's clear. And aggregating and showing big figures for certain countries is one thing, but it's also important to look at the other, the long tail of the European Union, and that's one point. The other is that how you qualify the figures is important. I would note that the British Film Institute reported that for last year, investment spend on film and high-end television for independent UK production amounted to 9% for film and 15% for high-end television. Now, I'm not going to get into a debate about what is European or not, but I think that if you have films that are predominantly financed and really produced by non-UK, it distorts the policy conclusions when those same films appear in analyses of, say, streaming content that goes cross-border. And, you know, it's fine to express those numbers. They just have to be footnoted somewhere. So that's my first sort of comment. In terms of the exhibition sector and our attitude, first of all, it is very important to us. We had a pretty good year last year, I think above average compared to the EU averages. We were at somewhere in the vicinity of 70% on admissions compared to 19, which was truly a record year. And this year is growing further, so we expect to get closer to, if not equal, 2019. There were a lot of films exhibited, a lot of backlog from COVID was in the cinemas last year and starting in the previous year. And so there's a bit of an aberration on the number of films, which will be important for the discussion we'll have later. We support the exhibitors. Croatia provides support to independent cinemas, we call them art house independent. We support their digitalization, we support their modernization, and it's not a small amount. We have at least 60 independent cinemas. They get about 700,000 euros a year. A further 300,000 goes to supporting the programs of independent cinemas. We have the Rencontres du Cinéma, for example, every year. This year we're running a national program where we've curated films that we have had over the 15-year history of the Croatian Audiovisual Center, and we prepared those for the cinemas. And I would also add that when you look at the whole picture on exhibition, it's important to underscore that Croatian exhibitors benefit from a privileged VAT, 5%, which is not a God-given right. It was provided to promote the development of the exhibition sector in Croatia. It succeeded. There are lots of multiplex screens around. There's an insufficient reciprocal contribution sometimes from those very same cinemas to the promotion of our titles and European titles, which I bemoan, and we're working on it. We're trying to get more support from the exhibitors for those titles. And I do consider that a privilege entails responsibilities as well.
Thank you, Chris. So you don't seem so pessimistic. You join a bit the view of Laurent. At the end, there is more attendance than in football venues, and there is already some support which is granted. I would ask my next question to Thomas as a representative of a regional fund in Sweden, and also as the author of this study on public funding at a crossroad, and which gives a good overview of the sector. Would you say that there is a specific need for support for theatres to bring back the audiences? You mentioned, Chris, the need to have more European films in programmation in theatres. Would you agree? Is there a need for support for cinemas in local areas, in rural areas? How do you see it, Thomas?
Yeah, as a principle, I will say I'm pro support to exhibitors, to movie theaters. I think it, depending on what type of political system you have, it's a question what level should give that support. Because I will say in certain countries you will probably find quite strong local support from municipalities and cities, and that's, for instance, the case in Sweden. It's much more important with the local support than it's from national and or regional level, and that doesn't mean that regions shouldn't involve themselves in exhibition or the situation for movie theaters. So in principle, yes. I will say some other things if I have that I think link to this question, because when we made the first study, we interviewed 725 persons across the value chain, and we did that as a bottom-up study. So we interviewed predominantly people dependent on public funding, producers. We talked with distributors. We talked with owners of movie theaters, but of course also with broadcasters, streamers, international sales agents, etc., etc. And that was the ambition for that. In the new one, that's not really the case. But very interesting is that basically all movie theater owners we talked with, and that was quite many. And we also did some workshops with movie theater owners and also distributors. They said one thing, and it's not always the case that you want to say that on stage, but I will say it. Everybody talked about one thing: less is more. We cannot deal with so many films. We haven't the capacity. Because the interesting thing is that if we have gone further back in history, we could see that it's been a dramatic rise in the number of films released in movie theaters, but it's not been the same rise when it comes to capacity. So of course this is a very difficult situation, and it's also a difficult situation for distributors if they handle too many films, because they cannot give enough curation, enough effort into that specific film. So less is more something like, doesn't matter if you're very commercial or very art house, it's a way to address the audience better. And then, of course, we come back to the numbers of films that we produce in Europe with public support.
That
And I
would be
think we will discuss that
the next
later. We will discuss that later, because I think that's also very crucial, and it's very much when we have presented and discussed this report across Europe, I can say that's predominant, at least up until perhaps early this year, that was the most discussed thing among the participants in those different events.
Thank you, Thomas. I think we can maybe move to the next discussion.
Thanks for the transition. Number of films. Just before a clarification and reassurance, at the observatory, when we deal with admission to European films, we systematically make a difference between. We do not enter the debate on nationality, but you will find in our publication the number of admission for European film or films shot in Europe funded by US studios. So the information is here. It's not a discussion on nationality, but you have the information. So yes, let's move from cinemas to the production of film. And I'm also going to paraphrase what Thomas just said. Maybe I'll ask I'll start with you, Mariela. I would like, in very naive terms, to understand to which extent or how many films do actually rely significantly on cinema exhibition. Is it a part of the business model? Is it for exposure? Yeah.
In Spanish case, is absolutely a matter of financing, because it is completely related with the public funds. So if you don't release in theaters, you don't have access to the public funds. And that makes this year, 2022, we have 320 films produced that have to go to the theaters because they receive public fund, which is a big increase from before the pandemic. And your question was, is interesting, is not interesting? Yes, of course it's interesting having the varieties, the spice of life, so it's interesting. What is happening now, what I feel, I don't know, in the other countries, is that the way of programming gives a lot of noise. It's very confusing for the audience. You have one film 1 hour, and then you don't have it in the rest, but next week it comes to its horizontal programming, which has really changed the perception of the audience, I feel. There's also the shortening of windows that makes that the audience feel that the less exclusivity of the film, of the cinemas. So there's kind of perception that every film that's released in the cinemas will go after to a platform. So people say, okay, I see it later. And that has become a big problem. And also that many of the author or the, the audience that goes to see the art movie films or the Spanish films get confused, because you see it in the programming of the film, of the cinema, but then you go and it's in another time, in another slot. And also I have to point something that I think it's very important, we haven't spoken about it. It's about the media, the press, the relationship we used to have with the press. The press also changed so much that they don't have space for the cinema information. They don't have any more. I remember producing Ken Loach films and having one whole page of a Ken Loach interview. That doesn't exist anymore. So the relationship with the audience and the knowledge of what is being shown has completely changed. You have a really short news of what happened in Cannes, really short, for maybe, if you are lucky, 24 hours. Then it moved and it's on the bottom of the page and you lost it. So I realized when I see what's going on in the cartelera, how do you say cartelera? In the what's going on cinemas, that I don't know the films that are being shown. And years before, I knew everything of the films that were shown.
I'm going to be a little bit rude, so sorry about that. But my question would be, generally speaking, when you have a success in cinemas, is it a bonus for you, or do you need it to recoup your investments? So, to both of you, to Mariela or Dida, yeah.
Of course, when you have a success, it's a bonus, because it's a bonus in your territory and it's a bonus in terms of international.
But you do not need it from your financing plan.
It depends on your financing plan, I would say.
Yeah.
It's on the film.
Mm-hmm. What Mariela was saying also about how distribution for us is key as producers, producing cinema, film for cinema, is that, especially in France, in some other European countries, we have a pre-financing system that we are pre-selling our films, and the distributors that are our partners, one of our essential key partners, are pre-selling the films and are part of our financing plan. They're basing also, and the TV actually, are pre-buying the film from us based on what the distributor thinks of the potential of our films. If we don't find any distributor willing to bet on our film and to pre-buy it, then the TV won't come. Then the regional fund won't come. And then we're stuck and we can't produce the film. So this is how important the distribution is for us, producers. So we need to be supporting each other, because we will all die otherwise. We really need the distribution system to still listen to what are our problems. And of course, a lot of producers are actually putting a lot of risk on producing films, not paying themselves, and even investing in these films. And of course, if the film works, the other financier will recoup first, and then eventually the producer who has invested his own salary and overheads will maybe recoup a bit. If the film was financed well and he could already pay himself, yeah, it could be a bonus. But most of the time, as we know, art house film is difficult to finance. And of course, like if the film works, everyone is happy. And it's vital, because lots of producers are not paying themselves. And I think that a lot of people doesn't know about it.
I completely agree. and of course, and also in the distribution side, because of the difficulties of the pandemic and before, in Spain at least, distributors don't advance P&A. It's the producer that advance P&A. So for us, that the film has success in the theaters is recouping part of the investment that normally is our fee, because you go and you arrive to the financing and say, okay, let's go and let's see if we find a distributor that bets. Never happens. And so you have to put your own fee to release the film. So it's important, the recoupment.
But this is really different from one country to another, because in most of the countries, and for all foreign films, distributors are advancing the P&As. So it's
very
really
specific to Spain.
But something important to say as a distributor is, despite of the pandemic, the rise of the platforms and the streamers, most of our revenue still comes from the cinemas. And once again, we are lacking some data on the VOD. I was in another panel last year saying, so I will say it again. On the European level, it will be really important if this could be mandatory as well to get the figures, because we are always talking about the theatrical figures, and then on the VOD we are only talking on the offer, the number of films that are proposed to the that are available, and we never looked. We don't have the data on the demand. How many people are really watching those films? And it's really important and interesting to have those this data. As a distributor, I know my figures, and I'm lucky that in Switzerland we passed a law a few years ago, so we have those data, and we see that most of the films that are viewed on the platforms are films that were already in the cinemas. So the huge majority of the offer is new films that were not proposed to cinema, but when we look at the demand, those who are watching the films, it's really the films that are released in cinema that are watched on platforms. And if we want to get some, and for art house titles, the most important way of getting some income are still the theaters, the platforms, and mostly the SVOD platforms. They don't really care on films. They are doing originals or series. But films, even films that were successful in festival, that had some success in the theaters, it's still really a small amount of money that we could get from the streamers for those kind of films. And TV is still important, and TV is becoming to be an issue as well, because it's more and more difficult to sell the films to the TVs. We had some discussion among our colleagues on Europa Distribution, saying that we're also seeing that some of the TV channels are stopping to buy some European films because they are co-producing or producing more and more films in order to have the quota. So we also have an issue on that.
Sophie, maybe we could start talking about this less is more hypothesis we already heard.
Yeah, I was just thinking that in the end, the debate on the release windows has always been very lively, and with these new changes, especially accentuated with the pandemics and the new type of release strategies of the studios, this has come again on the public agenda, public policy agenda. Just wanted to ask you, Chris, as a representative of film agencies in general, Mariella mentioned that in the end, the theatrical exploitation is the condition to access public funding, and we know that most films depend on this public funding. Is this still a key criteria of your approach as a film agency, this theatrical window?
Yes, it absolutely is. I mean, we co-finance maybe 6 to 8 feature films a year, plus minority co-productions. We have a responsibility to our society to promote and protect cultural diversity in Croatia, and if we didn't provide the support to make those 6 or 8 movies, they wouldn't be made. There's no chance. We've talked to some of the streamers about maybe coming into the market and providing a little boost. That's not happening either. So we depend on the theatrical release. We depend on state aid, and it's called state aid in our case. It's called fiscal measures or fiscal incentives. But it's also fiscal incentives are also state aid, and let's not forget that the production of bigger players in Europe is supported by state aid. It's money that is coming from the Treasury or that the Treasury is foregoing on behalf of those films. So state aid is pervasive in the whole system here. And I think words matter, and so we should call it either all state aid or all incentives, because they're very, very similar. And it does matter, and they're under attack. I mean, the whole idea of cultural diversity is taking a back seat now at the altar of, and at risk of being sacrificed really at the altar of a single market. We've seen that the members of the Association of Commercial Television are already aiming in a certain direction on the next edition of the AVMS directive. They're aiming for what they call tax incentives, I call state aid, to supplant quotas and incentive and levies, to make a kind of a homogeneous playing field in the future. And they are equally advocating provisions in pending legislation, the Media Freedom Act, which has a very important role to play in preserving media freedom, where some countries might be abusing that freedom and substituting or trying to justify abusive measures on the basis of cultural diversity and cultural policy. I think that's an abuse. But the cure for it is not balanced right now in the legislation. And I think that if we're not careful about what happens with the Media Freedom Act, which will become a regulation and obligatory, we may find our cultural policies reviewed by the former regulators of television broadcasters who have an inclination towards broadcasters, who might be inclined towards the single market, except maybe when it comes to territorial licensing, where they want to preserve that little exception. But there's a whole complex series of events evolving now, which really does require that we pay attention, lest we find ourselves in a precarious position in a few years.
Thank you. That's very interesting input. Thomas, it is important, you say it, and however, we see that some more flexible approach are popping up with the SVOD financing, also the production. We have seen in France, for example, a law which, depending on the input of financial contribution, gives more flexibility to these windows. Thomas, what do you think of this evolution? Are we going towards an increased flexibility from the legal perspective?
Yeah, in reality, we are going towards more flexibility because in certain parts, this is really to say, Europe is extremely multifaceted. In certain parts, you have streamers as strong commissioners of local content. In other parts of Europe, a lot of countries, you have no presence of streamer when it comes to commissioning local content. But if you are in a situation where they actually commission local content, then I will say that in more and more cases, projects are financed in something that we call the gray zone. And the gray zone is basically that the streamer accepts that the underlying rights and the rights sometimes as a whole belongs to the producer, to the production company. There exists a domestic window or a window that can cover a couple of countries, depending a little bit of the financial structure of the specific project. That means that that film can be in cinemas for a normal period, and it can also have a transaction VOD window. Nordisk, for instance, have one of those. Kampen om Narvik, the fight about Narvik, a very big Netflix success, but it was actually first in cinema in Norway. Another Norwegian example, perhaps more interesting, is Krigsseileren, that also made a festival round, one of the most expensive films in Norway ever, but produced by a hardcore art house producer, and very much a drama that was in cinema for quite a long period of time, and but Netflix bought out. So there is new models coming up that transform the realities and the situation, and of course that means that the entire media chronology doesn't exist anymore. And to my knowledge, at least, and I know examples more or less from entire Western Europe, is that unfortunately, since I'm a movie theater lover, this is very profitable for the producer. Extremely profitable, because you get really well paid, particularly if they buy out a lot of territories in that model. So it's very hard to resist, even for those that really wants and strongly believe in films in movie theaters. I will also comment about another thing, because I totally, whoever said it, because the reason why we have because in my opinion we have, and vast majority of the people we interviewed, we have an overproduction of small films in Europe, meant for traditional distribution. Not that they shouldn't be produced, but meant for traditional distribution. because they get no room there, they get no audiences there, they get no real attendance there. So and who are to blame? Who are we to blame? We are to blame, public funders, because it's our fault, because we have a lot of volume indicators and not enough indicators that links our decisions to art and or audiences. And I think this is a very big problem, because I've read so many reports, but a very important thing is to report how many films were supported by the film agency, the regional film fund, whatever. And in my opinion, that's not the way we can approach the future, because we should also understand that. And back to Chris, because I told one of the most debated things right now is incentive versus you can say selective film funding. What should we really care about? What should we secure for the future? But the problem is that money for selective funding will not increase. Nobody believes that this will increase. It will be, probably might be on the same level, and with a very strong inflation and even stronger sector inflation, that means that the value of public money is less. The selective public money. Okay, you can combine, in some countries, you can combine this with incentive funding, but overall, I think this also forces regional film funds and national film agencies to actually do sharper, prioritize. What should we do? Where are we important? And I think this is probably the most crucial thing for film funds in the midterm future. And to be very, I have run a fund for 25 years, Film Invest, and Film Invest, we have had zillion billion films here in Cannes, winning 3 Panders or whatever. I mean, and we are an investor, so quite different compared to some other funds. But I mean, so we have a really strong relationship to film as art. But I still think that it's all of us, depending on whatever level we work as public film agencies, we need to sit down and really talk about the future purpose and their priorities. And that might mean some hard discussions regarding the legal framework as well.
Thank you, Thomas. You already answered my next question on the less is more approach. So I would ask Chris, you would like to react on
Yeah,
this?
I mean, less would be close to nothing for us. So it's not an option. It simply is not. We will continue to finance at about that level of productions. We will have more funds for those productions, contrary to what you predict or what you think is appropriate, Thomas. The reason is no, we will be increasing the funding available, because our diagnosis of the situation we have right now, in part, is that we chronically underfinance those productions. We have a budget for our productions that is much smaller than the cash rebate budget that produces 15 projects a year, very successful, attracts investment in Croatia. But we want to establish a little bit better balance between those programs, and not taking away from the cash rebate program, but building up the domestic program. Because if we don't, we won't be producing Croatian films. There's no magic wand that's coming our way. No big streamer is coming in to make us, as I said to Thomas in one of our first calls, we are not swimming in money right now, and we don't have the luxury of the choices he's advocating.
Okay, so less is more is not applicable to all the countries in the same way. Maybe we can look now more into the producers themselves. Gilles, I will let you.
Maybe my first question for you, Didar. I was under the impression that through TV series, the streamers, that the commissioning model was getting speed. But I'm asking myself, does it relate really to film? So is it really the case also for film? And second part of the question, if I listen correctly to Thomas, it seems to induce that's maybe a discussion of the past, the commissioning, because he's describing a gray zone with the best of both worlds, commissioning plus rights remaining for domestic exploitation. So to make it simple, do you see a threat in moving to a pure commissioning model specifically for film? I do not want to discuss TV series.
Yeah, and I would like also to comment a little bit what have been said here. Less is more is really scaring me, this sentence, as a producer, of course. And I think that any kind of funds could have his own philosophy of being on films that have to recoup, absolutely. But our public funding system, I'm really happy and glad to be in a country like France when we as producers, we can have those public policies supporting us on developing our films. And today, of course, the whole question of the platforms having so much money to invest and more investing in IP, where some producers can't take that risk, but still willing to take that risk, and owning IP, which is the identity of the country, the identity of Europe as European producers. We have to keep on being able to buy those IP and develop films and take those risks. And when we are actually in front of platforms that we are really happy to work with, but if they have more means and money to acquire those IP won't be European anymore, right? So we're going to lose a lot of our identity and a lot of our diversity, which is an essential point of our identity as European producers. And I think it's key. And we won't be able to keep as independent producers to do that if we're not having the support of public fundings in being able to develop diversity films, which is our identity. And we'll be able to work with platforms and keep more and more of our rights and be more and more commissioned by them because we still want to do films. So yeah, this is exactly the threat I see coming.
But just to nuance, do you see the same appetite for platforms for film IP than for TV series IP? I'm trying to make the nuance between the fact that they seem very aggressive regarding TV series, and I have not exactly the same feeling regarding films. But
actually, in France, it's a bit different because we actually integrated the platforms in the chronology of media that we have in France, which is very protective of the theatrical release. And now platforms can invest, on behalf of pay TVs in our ecosystem, and they have also obligations of investing in certain type of film and to respect the diversity that is very important to us. So they have a certain amount of the budget dedicated to audiovisual and the rest for TV, for films. So this is actually quite regulated. But yeah, we can say that the platforms, of course, are more eager to produce TV series than film because they're longer. So they have more subscribers. I think that's like, the basic.
Mariela, your feedback on, again, the move to commissioning regarding film again. I'm trying to be specific.
I also wanted to comment on the less is more. Because it's true that the funds have, as Didar said, their own philosophy, but it's true that the impact of the funds have at an industry level. I mean, the funds generate work, generate providers, generate industry. So it's not only about how many films we do, how many films we release, but also of a network of the industry that is supported by maybe small companies or bigger companies, but that they relied on the amount of films that are done, and that also gives back the money we have taken from the treasure. So I think it is a revolving think that it's important.
And I would like to add something else. Also, COVID has been, very interesting for us in terms of it's interesting always to look at what happened during COVID. And when the film couldn't be released for a huge period of time in many countries, suddenly when the distributors were able to release them, they were suddenly, okay, so is there any film we're going to sacrifice? Is there any film that we're going to decide not to release because maybe they don't have the potential enough now that people are not going to cinema anymore the way they did, etc. And so suddenly we faced this very dangerous phase when distributors were choosing the film that they already paid for to sacrifice or not. And that was the most scary time, for our talents, for us as producers. And then it was, what's going to work in the cinema? That was the cruelest period for the industry. And I think that afterwards, during certain times, some distributors decided to think that way. I'm going to try to buy different type of films or focus on more the films that are going to work in cinema and not to bet on those more fragile films, which is really, really dangerous for us, of course.
Laurent, have you changed your investment decisions?
Not totally, but in a sense, yes, because you know that certain type of films won't perform anymore. Those with really those hard films, but I'm still buying them, but I know that it's only a few of them, but I'm releasing only 12 to 15 films, so I know that I will still have 2 or 3 films that I know that will be hard to recoup, but that I love, that I want to show them. And for the rest, yes, films that where I think I could appeal to an audience, and it's always, you said that before, it's only a balance thing. We shouldn't say, okay, we don't want all those films, they shouldn't exist anymore. We don't do them and we focus only on films that could appeal to an audience. We need to rebalance it. And on the less is more, as a distributor and as an exhibitor, I agree that we have too many films and it's difficult to release them because they are competing with each other. It's not, when you are releasing an European film, it's not Avatar or Top Gun who are your main competitor. Your main competitors are the other European films. And we saw in the previous slides that in Europe there were 1,700 or so European films that were released last year compared to 200 or 250 American films. And when we look, I see that we have Lucia Recalde here from media. The funds that we have as distributor to release non-European films in our territory are mostly the funds from media. And the selective support is supporting how many? 30, 35 films? 40 films max out of these 1,700 films. There are only a handful of them that will get distribution support. So I believe we could, if there were 1,500 films, European films that are produced and released every year, we wouldn't really notice, and I don't think we'll see a drop of quality because those 200 films were not produced. And if this money could go to the, one part of this amount will go to the other films to be better produced, because we also know that most of the films are underproduced, and it's also a problem, not any days of shooting and so on. And part of this money could go as well into distribution in order for those films to be seen. I think it's something that should be addressed at European level and as well as for every film funds, for national films.
Yeah, can I have a... Yeah, because that's
we
also
have 5
the
minutes
answer.
left, so...
Yeah, more money to fewer films, so we can produce better films. And this is not about non-diversity, because everybody believes in diversity. So it's still about making hardcore art house and very commercial films, and different thematics and everything else. So that's not, the debate is a little bit more complex.
No, I think we heard the point of view. I get the question is which of the films and so on. So, but I think everyone made this a point. Sophie, we have time for the last question, maybe on independent.
Can I say something about the commissioning?
Yeah. Okay.
In the at least in Spain, and I think it's in general because of the numbers of figures they give about the films commissioned 100% as originals. They are bets of the platforms of the commissioners, very few per year, but it's true that they are kind of competing with us in those middle range films. Like I have an example that we were talking before, that it was a typical co-production film that would have been a Spanish-Argentinian co-production, like Argentina 1985, that was produced, its original for a platform. And that is a change, because those kind of films would have been a co-production.
I was producing all his previous films.
Yeah. So that range of films, it is a problem. And maybe it's also because there's the public money for bigger films is smaller, maybe.
Sophie?
Yes, so maybe I will merge my two last questions. Dider, you mentioned the importance of IP for the identity, for producers as an asset. European ownership is also something that you mentioned that is important. However, we have seen that from the legal point of view, there is no real clear definition, despite the fact that all policies are based on this concept. So my question would be to Chris, how do you think, is the independent production still part of the vision from a film agency? And do you think there would be a need for more rules as to what is independent production, especially in view of the changes in the market?
Yeah, I think independent production is crucial. They're intimately linked with cultural diversity, and I think without independent production, we will all suffer. Do we need a definition? We need to work on the definition. IP is certainly, IP rights is certainly part of an equation. It's really a multi-dimensional equation that we need, though. It's also, where's the money coming from? Who is really in control of the work that's being created? And there I see, the makings of a proper definition. And in the absence of one now for the streaming world, there are not rules actually there, and I think we need to look at it. I would also, since I have the floor probably for the last time this morning, make a plea to for all of us and for the Commission to look at avoiding this race to the bottom with tax incentive cash rebate schemes. I mean, it's good. Those models are good. They have a useful function. But if we keep being forced to compete against each other and raise the levels, it first of all will mean the richer will prevail. But secondly, it's an unhealthy state aid situation where you keep raising the money. So that's something that policymakers need to take a look at, in my view. Sorry.
Thank you. As a last question to all of you, a bit maybe difficult, I'm sorry. What is cultural diversity today? We have talked about the number of films, the shorter windows that they have in films, theaters. What is cultural diversity? Is it in the end the number of films that are produced, that are available, or is it a question of accessing these films? What would you say? Laurent, starting with you.
Okay, for me, I think we should look at the audience, and it's a market share of non-American films, because we are still in a world, and it's mostly the case in the theaters, but it's extremely the case on the streamers, really with the dominance of American films. So we need to secure the European level of cinema and online admissions. And it's already diversity. And then within that, you have art house titles, you have commercial titles, but still it's the importance of having this voice of European content.
Thank you. Dita, what do you think?
Well, I think that I said it many times during the panel. I think that it's key for us to still have the support of the public fundings in our countries to be able, as independent producers, to develop as an independent producer, whatever definition it is. For us in France, we're basing ourselves as independent producers on the European definition that is either linked to a broadcaster or not in certain percentage or have any extra European shareholders. So this is very important to keep that definition quite clear, and we stick to it. And because there is more and more producers company that are being bought by bigger companies that have extra European shareholders. So this is actually also the threat, to be able, as an independent producer, to still, have an eye on this definition and to be able to produce film in diversity and to stay united in diversity in Europe and to keep our identity.
Thank you. So, some homework for the legislator. Thomas?
Yes, I think we need to look very carefully to some actual facts, and one is actually what Chris mentioned, the thing about growing incentives, selective funding on the same level or perhaps a little bit more, and what does this mean? Because it's like Europe have two audiovisual policies in reality, and they are not coherent. And I think it's very important that we find some sort of coherence between those two type of funding, and that's also if we want to secure position for diversity and for independent producers, whatever, it's very hard to define. We found in the second report, we defined at least 8 different definitions of existing in Europe about what is an independent producer, and this is also blurred by the fact that not in all part of Europe, but in substantial parts of Europe, the production landscape is totally dominated by production company owned by, let's call it the big 5 or whatever, the production conglomerate groups. And this is also a tricky thing when we start discussing, debating, defining independent producer. And I think this is very crucial, because should we kick them out from the system? That's not so easy in many countries, because they are also good providers of strong local content. On the other hand, I will say that very many companies inside those structures, they don't really own and control their IPs. We have so many examples given to us where actually if you have a substantial income, you need to deliver to your mom. You don't control how you sell these rights, etc., and you sometimes not even control your decision about what projects to support. So, and this goes definitely against the classical definition of an independent producer. And I will say one thing that unite, I think, all film agencies, doesn't matter if they are transnational, national, or regional. Like the Norwegian Film Studios CEO said to me, we are the biggest defender of producers' ownership of rights, and the biggest defender of independent producers. Actually, a lot more aggressive in that position than many that actually is forced to live in a landscape and to be more pragmatic.
Bravo.
Yes, it's difficult to speak after him, but I completely agree that a key thing is the definition. Maybe we should accept that there's not only one definition. Maybe we should have to do definitions for purposes for independent producers, but it's key to how to say to secure those independent producers in each country, and also something that, as Didar said, I agree with everything about the financing, but also I think for the IP, to keep the IP is essential to have money to develop. That we haven't spoken about, but the money to develop, it's key to keep the IP, because if you cannot develop your own ideas or your own IP, then you have to kind of be in the position of accepting commissioning. So I think it's something key.
Just sorry, the definition I was mentioning, for us, mostly it's the definition by media, which is our standard.
Chris, would you like to?
Yes, sure. I'm listening to a follow-up discussion here, but I agree with pretty much everything that's been said. It's not about kicking anybody out. It's about who qualifies for certain requirements, for certain legislative requirements that are relatively modest. The 30% quota for streamers is modest, 50% for broadcasters. Has a proven track record. It's worked. It's promoted European production, and I hope the same will happen with the quota for streamers. I would add, just simply to what has been said, or recall that the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union has the provisions that were mentioned, and that those apply to the whole of the European Union. So cultural diversity means from the very smallest to the very biggest, and they all have to be foreseen in the solutions that are proposed, in the support that is provided by media and elsewhere to ensure that diversity.
Yeah, concluding word?
Yes, apparently me. Well, cultural diversity is very important for all cinema networks in Europe, simply by the fact that around between 15 and 35% of the revenue is coming from European producers. And it's obvious for all cinema networks in Europe that despite the capacity which is fixed and constant, and we have to do a curation of movies, then actually we always, and that is, I understand, actually is a tacit understanding for all cinemas, we actually give space and capacity to even titles that we would very likely not gain anything from. But the understanding is that we need to preserve the European production network, and that is a tacit understanding for all networks, even how commercial they are.
Thanks a lot. Susanna, do you want to close?
I think I have to, so I already sneaked up here to signal that we have to soon free the room, but I won't do so without one or two words. We sought out to understand what has changed in production and exploitation, and I do think we have seen that quite a lot has changed, but we have also seen that quite a lot has stayed the same. Just think of the importance of distribution or of funding. We have also seen that what I don't think has changed is a very strong dedication demonstrated by our panelists to the market itself and to their understanding of what diversity there means. What has also not changed is that, of course, they have different ideas of what funding policies should do. Now, I want to pick up on the less is more, but not in the context that it was said, but in the context of the observatory. I do hope that you all think that in our case, less would not be more. At least we took really note of many things that we could still work on, including that it would have been great to have a question and answer session for which the time is unfortunately never enough. So with this, I can assure you that our Department for Market will look into the new idea of benchmarking our figures with the audience figure of football matches. I love this idea. It's actually to be followed up, and pay lots of attention to the hidden importance of zeros. And I think for the legal department, there will be a long list of items to follow, and definitions might be quite high up. That leaves me to thank these fantastic panelists. It has been a pleasure to have you. There were moments where I thought, actually, you don't need moderation. You do that quite well and disciplined among yourselves. So thanks a lot also for that. Thank you to you, audience, for your stamina, that you are still able to follow things that are longer than the short messages and video clips that we all get more and more used to. Highly appreciated. Thank you to the technicians, to all the staff of the Marché du Film for allowing us to do this event, and we look forward to being here again next week, maybe if there are sun.